Pangea, a journey to Earth's ancient supercontinent. Welcome. I want to take you somewhere tonight, somewhere far from here, far from now. I'm stepping back, so far back that the world beneath my feet no longer looks familiar. This is my journey into an Earth that existed hundreds of millions of years ago, long before cities, before oceans as I know them, and even before the map of the world began to resemble the one in my mind. This is the story of Pangaea, a single massive continent that once stretched across much of the planet's surface, holding nearly all the land on Earth in one unbroken sweep. It's a name many people have heard in passing, tucked between diagrams in schoolbooks or mentioned in quiet documentaries. Yet few stop to imagine what it would have actually been like. What would I see if I could stand there? How would it feel to breathe that air? To walk across a landscape that had no familiar boundaries, and to look at a sky that had not yet been framed by the geography I know? Letting go of the map to understand this world, I first have to let go of the map that lives in my head. There was no Atlantic Ocean splitting the Americas from Europe and Africa. There was no vast Pacific cutting across the center of the globe. Instead, there was one continuous landmass. If I could have walked across it, I might have begun in the north of what is now North America and kept moving east, crossing into what we now call Europe and Asia without ever setting foot on a ship. I could have turned south and passed into Africa and South America without ever seeing an ocean break the horizon. There was only land, stretching farther than any traveler could hope to walk in a lifetime, bordered by a single immense ocean that wrapped around it like a ring. This world, however, was not quiet. It was not a place of stillness frozen in deep time. The Earth has always been restless, and in the age of Pangaea it was no different. Powerful forces moved beneath the surface, invisible but unrelenting. They pushed continents together, welding them into one. They folded mountains out of the crust, split deep valleys, and sent volcanoes rising to paint the sky in fire and ash. The interior world, at the center of this enormous land, life unfolded in conditions almost unimaginable to me. Far from the ocean, the climate was harsh. Without seas to carry moisture inland, there were vast stretches of arid land where rain rarely fell. Summers could turn into suffocating heat, while winters brought biting cold. The seasons were intense, the air dry and the sky seemed to stretch endlessly, broken only by the outline of mountains in the far distance, or the silhouettes of forests adapted to this demanding world. Even so, life filled every corner. Towering plants covered parts of the landscape, while in other regions, red deserts rolled toward the horizon. Creatures I would not recognize walked across that ground. Strange reptiles, some with features that hinted at the first mammals, and insects that grew far larger than any I would see now. The Earth was alive, but it was a different kind of life, one shaped by the strange rules of this unified world. A world without boundaries. Perhaps the most striking thing of all was the absence of boundaries. Today, I'm used to a planet cut into pieces by oceans, but in the age of Pangaea, there were no such barriers. A river could begin in what we now call Asia and wind its way into what would become Europe without ever being stopped by a sea. Forests could stretch across regions that would one day be split into entirely different continents. The same species of animals could roam freely from one end of the land to the other. It was one Earth, undivided, its surface open and connected in a way that is almost impossible for me to imagine now. Yet for all its size, Pangaea was never permanent. The forces that built it were always at work, and even as they held it together, they were preparing to tear it apart again. That is the nature of this planet. Continents drift, oceans open and close, mountains rise and fall. But while Pangaea lasted, it left marks that can still be seen today, shaping the evolution of life and carving out the deep foundations of the world I know. The forces that built it before I reach the moment when Pangaea first began to split. I need to begin even earlier, with the forces that brought it into being in the first place. Because to understand what it was like to live on that ancient continent, I first need to understand how the Earth gathered itself into one. The story begins not with a single dramatic event, but with slow, constant movement. Beneath my feet, the Earth's crust is broken into enormous plates that glide over the softer, hotter material beneath. This motion is gradual, measured in centimeters per year, but given enough time, it reshapes the entire face of the planet. Long before Pangaea, there were other supercontinents, Rodinia, Nuna, and others whose names are rarely spoken outside geology classrooms. They came together, they broke apart, and their pieces drifted, setting the stage for Pangaea to rise. Over hundreds of millions of years, smaller continents and island chains collided, merging into larger and larger land masses. Each collision folded mountains into the sky, built long ranges of stone, and left deep scars in the crust. These ancient seams still exist today, hidden in the bedrock beneath my feet. Slowly, these pieces fused together until at last, the Earth held only one vast land. The scale of it all, it is almost impossible for me to grasp the scale of this. Imagine me standing in the interior of Pangaea, thousands of kilometers from the nearest ocean. The air would have been different, the climate harsher. There would have been no familiar sense of proximity to a coast, no smell of salt on the breeze. It was a world of interiors, of deep, continental heartlands where seasons could turn extreme and isolation was profound. And yet, this very isolation shaped the living world. Insects grew in size, perhaps because of higher oxygen levels in the atmosphere. Reptiles adapted to survive in the dry heat of the interior, while in other regions near the coasts, early forests created green corridors for life to spread. It was in this crucible of shifting climates and connected landscapes that many of the ancestors of future creatures, dinosaurs, mammals, and even early birds, would eventually emerge. The land itself bore marks of constant change. Volcanoes erupted, painting the sky with ash that would settle into the soil. Rivers carved long valleys carrying minerals from the rising mountains to the lowlands. Deserts expanded and retreated with the seasons. It was a planet in motion, but one bound together by a single colossal continent. The winds of Pangaea everywhere I looked, the signs of that unity were written in stone and sky. Even the winds must have felt different. On a modern Earth, oceans break up and redirect global air currents. But in the time of Pangaea, the absence of those dividing seas meant that wind could sweep across thousands of kilometers with little interruption. Dust from inland deserts could have blown all the way to the coastal edges, feeding nutrients into distant forests. Storms might have traveled farther, unbroken by oceanic boundaries. The entire planet's climate was influenced by the simple fact that nearly all the land was in one place. And so in this ancient world, every sunrise would have lit a horizon shaped by a single connected Earth. No distant continents to imagine, no hidden lands across vast oceans, just one world, whole and immense under the same sky. Before the Union, before there was one great landmass, the Earth was a very different place. Hundreds of millions of years before Pangaea came together, the planet was a patchwork of smaller continents scattered across the globe and drifting slowly over a deep, ancient ocean. These fragments of land did not stay in one place for long then, at least not on geological timescales. They moved as they always do, carried on the slow conveyor belts of tectonic plates. Mountains rose where they collided. Oceans opened when they split apart. Each shift was measured not in days or years, but in millions of years. And yet, every small movement was another step toward the creation of a single, united world. To understand how this happened, I have to imagine the Earth during the late Paleozoic era, roughly 300 million years ago. By this time, several large continental blocks were already drifting across the planet: Laurentia, which would become North America; Gondwana, which included the future landmasses of South America, Africa, Antarctica, Australia, and India, and smaller pieces like Baltica and Siberia. These were not yet connected, but they were on a slow collision course that would eventually bring them together in one colossal embrace. The cycle of supercontinents. The process began with earlier supercontinents long before Pangea. There was Rodinia, which existed nearly 1 billion years ago. When it broke apart, it scattered fragments of land into new positions, only for them to regroup later into another supercontinent called Pangaea. That one was short-lived. It too fractured, but its pieces began drifting toward one.
Another again. These repeated cycles of assembly and separation are part of what
geologists call the supercontinent cycle, a natural
rhythm of the Earth's crust, driven by the movement of tectonic
plates. As these fragments drew closer, oceans shrank between them. The Iapetus Ocean, for example, once lay between Laurussia, an early fusion of North America and parts of Europe, and Gondwana. Over millions of years, that ocean narrowed until it vanished entirely, crushed out of existence by the merging continents. When land meets land, the collision is not gentle. Rocks crumple like paper under enormous pressure. Whole mountain ranges rise where two plates lock together. The Appalachian Mountains in North America and parts of the Atlas Mountains in Africa are
relics of these ancient impacts, these scars of collisions
that help stitch Pangaea together. A strange world taking shape. The world during this time would have looked strange from above. I would see great land masses creeping toward one another, surrounded by an immense global ocean called Panthalassa. As the continents converged, island chains were swallowed up, their volcanic peaks crushed between colliding plates. Shallow seas vanished. The boundaries between one land mass and another blurred until at last all of them became one. But while this slow-motion collision was happening, the climate was changing as well. Large ice sheets still clung to parts of Gondwana, especially in regions that would one day become South America, Africa, and Antarctica. Evidence in the rocks, scratches left by ancient glaciers, tells me that even during the assembly of Pangaea, the Earth swung between colder and warmer intervals. As the continents collided and closed off smaller seas, ocean currents shifted, and the atmosphere began to take on a new rhythm. These changes in climate were not simply background details. They shaped the living world. When continents crash together, they create vast new highlands, and mountains change everything around them. They redirect wind. They trap moisture on one side while casting long rain shadows over the other. In the age before Pangaea fully formed, these shifting landscapes were already sculpting the path of evolution, setting the stage for what kinds of plants and animals would thrive when the supercontinent finally came to be. The Carboniferous forests. If I could stand on Earth in this time, I would see landscapes that felt familiar in some ways but alien in others. Vast stretches of lowland swamp covered parts of what would become North America and Europe. Towering forests of primitive trees spread across the horizon. These were the Carboniferous forests, so dense and humid that their decaying plants would one day form the coal seams we still mine today. The air was rich in oxygen, higher than what I breathe now, and that made it possible for some insects to grow to enormous sizes. Dragonflies with wings nearly 1 meter across skimmed above those forests. Giant millipede-like arthropods crept along the forest floor. It was a world that felt heavy with life, an Earth still experimenting with what it could become. To the south, Gondwana told a different story. Much of it lay closer to the polar regions, where glaciers carved across its surface. These frozen expanses were nothing like the warm swamps near the equator, yet they existed at the same time, part of a planet in transition. As the continents crept toward each other, climate zones shifted, drawing cold regions northward and pressing warm regions southward until finally they began to blend into a new global order. The final collisions, and then, over millions of years, the last great collisions began. Laurussia struck Gondwana, and mountain ranges buckled skyward. The smaller plates that once floated in between were caught and crushed. This was the moment Pangaea truly began to take shape. It was not a single event, but a long series of impacts and merges, each one pushing the planet closer to the world-spanning continent that would define an entire geological age. By the end of this process, the map of the Earth would have looked starkly simple. Nearly all the land on the planet sat fused into one vast expanse. Around it, Panthalassa stretched outward in every direction, a single global ocean that reached to the edges of the horizon no matter where I stood. Along one side of Pangaea, an inland sea known as the Paleotethys still lingered, a remnant of older oceans that had not yet fully closed. But even that would eventually fade, swallowed up as the continents pressed tighter together, and so the stage was set. The world had gathered itself into a single piece. The last collisions had passed. The mountains stood high. The deserts were already beginning to form in the deep interior, and the climate was shifting into patterns that would shape life for millions of years to come. But this was only the beginning of Pangaea's story. Now that the continents had come together, the world was about to change in ways far more dramatic than the slow collisions that created it. The transformation. Complete with the continents locked together, the Earth entered one of the most remarkable chapters in its history. Pangaea was no longer an idea in motion, it was real. The long collisions that had drawn land masses across thousands of kilometers were finished, and the world now stood as a single unified continent surrounded by an immense ocean. It was an Earth without the familiar divisions of today, and its sheer scale would have reshaped every part of the planet's surface. The making of Pangaea was not simply the merging of continents, it was the transformation of the entire Earth system. Mountain ranges rose where land had crumpled in the collisions. Deep scars in the crust became sutures, welding the fragments into a single piece. These scars remain visible even now. Geologists still trace them across continents separated by oceans, evidence of the places where once, long ago, they were joined. The violence of creation. The collision zones were violent. When plates crash together, the crust folds and fractures. Heat builds as rock grinds against rock. Magma forces its way upward, feeding chains of volcanoes that can run for thousands of kilometers. In Pangaea's birth, this process was relentless. The central regions of the supercontinent were shaped by the uplift of mountains that rivaled the scale of the Himalayas today. These ranges would later erode, their peaks worn down by time, but in their prime they mark the raw power of the planet's restless crust. At the same time, vast basins opened between those ranges. Rainwater and runoff from the new mountains carved wide river systems, cutting across the supercontinent's interior. These rivers fed wetlands and deltas that became some of the most fertile regions of their time. Fossils preserved in these ancient basins tell me the story of lush ecosystems that thrived in the shadow of the newly built highlands. The birth of the Great Desert. But the formation of Pangaea also created a new kind of land, one the Earth had never seen at such a scale. As the continents fused, the interior of this vast landmass moved farther and farther from the moderating influence of the sea. The result was a continental core so distant from the ocean that moisture from coastal regions rarely reached it. This gave birth to enormous deserts, some of which may have stretched for thousands of kilometers. The great expanse of the supercontinent's center was a land of extremes, a place where scorching summers and bitter winters ruled. while the edges of Pangaea near the surrounding ocean remained wetter and milder. This pattern of dry interiors and wetter coasts was one of the defining features of Pangaea.
Even now I can trace it in the rock record.
Red beds, layers of iron-rich sediment that formed in hot, arid conditions, are scattered across the continents that once made up Pangaea. These rocks are the ancient footprints of the deserts that spread across its heart. Meanwhile, coal deposits formed in swampy, humid regions tell me that near its coasts, dense forests flourished under heavy rains carried inland from the sea. The climate of extremes, the climate of Pangaea, was not only shaped by its size, but also by its position. During the height of the supercontinent's existence, much of it straddled the equator. That meant vast tropical belts crossed its middle, bringing heat and seasonal monsoons to some regions, while its southern and northern extremes reached deep into polar latitudes. No other arrangement of land in Earth's history has combined such an enormous range of climates on a single, connected continent. From frozen southern ice sheets to equatorial rainforests, all of it existed on one continuous piece of land. Life adapted to these extremes. In the warm, wet regions near the coasts, dense forests of seed ferns and towering conifer-like trees covered the land. Their roots stabilized the soil while their leaves formed vast green canopies that trapped humidity. These forests were home to early reptiles, amphibians, and an array of invertebrates, including insects of remarkable size. In the arid interior, life told a different story. There, plants evolved strategies to conserve water, and animals adapted to long stretches of heat and scarcity. It was a world of survival, where every adaptation was a response to the demands of an immense and unforgiving landscape. The changed oceans. The making of Pangaea also changed the oceans. With nearly all of the land gathered in one place, the surrounding sea, Panthalassa, became the dominant global ocean. Its currents circled the supercontinent, redistributing heat around the planet. Meanwhile, along one edge of Pangaea, the shrinking Paleotethys Sea persisted, an isolated remnant of earlier oceans. This sea became a vital pathway for marine life, a sheltered environment where reefs and shallow water ecosystems thrived even as the open ocean remained vast and deep. This arrangement of land and sea created powerful wind systems. Without the complex shapes of modern continents to break their flow, global wind patterns became more direct and intense. Seasonal monsoons swept across parts of Pangaea, carrying heavy rains to some regions while leaving others in perpetual drought. Dust from the interior deserts may have traveled immense distances, carried by winds across thousands of kilometers, before falling into the coastal forests or even settling into the ocean. The mixing of life, but perhaps the most striking result of Pangaea's formation was its influence on life's future. By uniting all the continents, Pangaea erased the barriers that had once separated ecosystems. Species that had evolved in isolation now came into contact with one another. Predators followed prey into new territories. Plants and animals spread into regions they could never have reached before. This mixing of life would shape evolutionary paths for millions of years. Fossils found today in places as far apart as South America, Africa, and India are often nearly identical, proof that during the age of Pangaea, the same species walked across lands that are now separated by entire oceans. The seeds of future change, even as Pangaea stabilized, it was never truly at rest. Deep within the earth, the same forces that had assembled it continued to move. Heat built beneath the crust, slowly weakening it in places. Faults formed, invisible at first, but these fractures would one day become the starting points for the great breakup that would scatter the continents again. But for now, Pangaea stood whole, an extraordinary arrangement that dominated the surface of the earth and defined an age. To walk across it, then, would have been to see the planet in a way no one can see it now. There was no distant coastline hidden beyond the horizon, no foreign continent waiting across an ocean. There was only one world, vast and connected, bound by the same sky, the same winds, and the same restless heartbeat of the earth beneath it. And it was here, in this unified world, that the next great chapter of life's history would begin. One world, endless horizons. With the earth gathered into one colossal landmass, the idea of distance changed forever. There were no oceans dividing one region from another, no isolated continent separated by thousands of kilometers of open water. Pangaea was a single continuous world from one horizon to the next. The land stretched on, unbroken by the familiar boundaries that shape my planet today. To understand this,
I imagine standing somewhere near the center of that vast continent.
I could walk in any direction for months and never see the glint of an ocean on the horizon. Instead, I would cross plains so wide that the sky seemed larger than it does now. I would pass rivers that wandered across entire regions, weaving through landscapes that had no borders. I would move from one climate to another, not because I had crossed an ocean, but because the land itself was so enormous the weather shifted gradually over unimaginable distances. Life without barriers, this was not a world of isolated ecosystems. In my modern age, oceans create natural barriers that separate species, giving rise to unique forms of life on each continent. But on Pangaea, those barriers did not exist. Plants and animals could spread freely, crossing vast stretches of land without ever being stopped by a sea. Fossils prove this. Identical species have been found on continents that are now separated by thousands of kilometers of ocean. Reptiles that once lived in what we now call South America also left their bones in Africa. Early plant species stretched across regions that today are scattered around. The globe-top Pangaea allowed life to move as if the entire world were one single connected habitat. The absence of borders also changed the way the land itself behaved. Winds could travel farther, unimpeded by mountain chains or broken coastlines. Massive air currents swept across Pangaea, carrying heat and dust from the dry interior toward the coasts. Rainfall, on the other hand, struggled to reach the heart of the continent. Moisture from the surrounding ocean would fall as rain along the edges of Pangea, feeding dense forests and wetlands. But by the time the air reached the deep interior, it had little left to give. What remained were vast, arid zones, deserts so expansive that they stretched farther than the modern Sahara. These dry regions formed a stark contrast with the humid belts near the coast, making Pangaea a world of extremes, the rivers as highways. The rivers that cut across the supercontinent carried more than water. They were highways for life. Early amphibians followed them from one region to another, their movements guided by the steady flow of fresh water. Along their banks, strange forests of ancient conifers and seed ferns created green corridors that connected one part of Pangaea to the next. Some rivers were so long that in my time their courses would cross multiple continents. Yet in Pangaea they were simply part of a single boundless landscape. And there were mountains, huge ranges born from the collisions that created Pangaea in the first place. These mountains rose where continents had once met head-on, their crumpled layers thrust toward the sky. Some of these ranges were immense, stretching across distances so great that they tied the land together like seams. Over time, erosion wore them down and rivers carried their sediments into the lowlands, enriching the soil and feeding vast floodplains. A journey. Across environments, traveling across this supercontinent would have meant passing from one environment into another in a slow, steady transition. From humid coastal forests, I would move into open savannas and grasslands. From there, I would enter deserts that seemed endless, their red sands broken only by rocky outcrops and the occasional winding river. Farther still, I might find forests again, fed by mountain rains that created their own small climates within the larger whole. Pangaea was unified, but it was never monotonous. Its sheer size allowed every kind of landscape to exist side by side, all stitched together on one colossal piece of land. The absence of borders also shaped the movement of animals. Early reptiles, the ancestors of creatures that would one day dominate the planet, could travel enormous distances across Pangaea without encountering an ocean. They spread out across this vast land, adapting to its many environments. Some settled in the wetter coastal forests, while others learned to survive in the dry interior. This mobility allowed species to spread quickly and widely, creating ecosystems that spanned much of the supercontinent. The scale of the sky must have felt different. On modern Earth, coastlines break the flow of wind and create regional weather systems. On Pangaea, the land was so massive that weather could roll across it for thousands of kilometers without interruption. Storms that formed near the coasts might sweep deep inland, their rain dwindling until it was nothing but dry wind. Monsoons could reach staggering scales, with seasonal shifts that drenched one side of the continent while leaving the other in crushing drought. Despite all of this, Pangaea was not an empty, silent place.
It was alive.
Primitive forests stretched across entire regions. Swamps near the coast teemed with amphibians and early reptiles. In the arid interior, tough, drought-resistant plants anchored the soil against the sweeping winds, while smaller animals darted between patches of shade. Even in its harshest landscapes, life persisted, carried across the continent by its open, unbroken reach, the overwhelming vastness. If I could stand there and look around, it might have been overwhelming. No horizon was close enough to feel familiar.
No ocean offered a natural edge to the world.
Everything stretched outward in every direction, as though the planet itself had grown larger. That sense of scale would have defined daily life on Pangaea. Travel was slow, movement was vast, and even the sky seemed to match the land beneath it in its immensity. This was a world where everything was connected, where mountains, deserts, forests, and rivers were all part of a single continuous earth. It was this unity that gave Pangaea its power. It shaped the winds and the rains. It guided the spread of plants and animals, and it prepared the stage for the next great transformations in the history of my planet, when this vast borderless land would begin to evolve and challenge every living thing that called it home. The coasts and the interior, although Pangaea was one continuous continent, it was not uniform. Its edges and its interior might as well have been different worlds. Along the coasts, the influence of the surrounding ocean shaped the land. Humidity from Panthalassa carried inland on steady winds, feeding lush forests and swamps where life thrived in abundance. But the farther I moved away from those coasts, the less of that oceanic influence remained. Step by step, the green of the coastal regions faded, replaced first by open plains and eventually by the stark, arid expanse of Pangaea's vast interior deserts. Life at the coasts. The coasts were places of constant motion and life. Warm, shallow seas met the land in wide tidal flats, estuaries where the boundaries between land and water blurred. Here amphibians lingered near rivers and wetlands. Early reptiles hunted in forests of towering conifers and seed ferns. Insects, some of them far larger than their modern relatives, buzzed through the humid air. The climate in these regions was warm and wet, regulated by the nearby ocean, and it allowed ecosystems to flourish much like the tropical belts of my world today. Fossils from these coastal zones showed dense vegetation and an extraordinary diversity of species. Some areas likely resembled the mangrove swamps of the modern world, with twisting roots and slow-moving waters teeming with early fish and invertebrates. Farther inland, but still within reach of the ocean's moisture, sprawling river systems cut through the land, feeding broad floodplains where forests grew thick and green. These regions would have been the most habitable parts of Pangaea, rich with food and shelter, their seasonal cycles predictable and steady. Journey to the desert heart, but every step away from the coasts carried me closer to a different kind of world. In the deep interior of Pangaea, rainfall was scarce. The same immense size that allowed Pangaea to connect nearly all of Earth's land also gave it one of its most defining features, a continental heartland, so far from the sea that it became a desert on a scale no modern
landscape can match. These deserts
were not small patches of sand like those I think of today. They were vast, stretching for thousands of kilometers, broken only by occasional rocky uplands or isolated rivers. Geologists have found evidence of these regions in the form of red beds, layers of iron-stained rock formed under hot, dry conditions. These rocks tell me that much of Pangaea's interior was a land of relentless sun and minimal rain, where only the hardiest forms of life could survive. In this interior, the air would have felt heavy during the day, the heat radiating off the ground in shimmering waves. At night, without the insulating presence of clouds or nearby oceans, the temperature would have dropped sharply, leaving the land cold under a canopy of brilliant stars. It was a world of extremes where survival demanded resilience. Plants here were sparse and tough, their roots deep, their leaves hardened against the loss of water. Small reptiles and early mammal-like creatures adapted to this environment, burrowing for shelter or becoming active during cooler hours to avoid the punishing sun. The transitional zones between these deserts and the coastal forests were transitional zones, regions of grasslands and open woodlands where the climate shifted gradually from wet to dry. These belts may have been the great highways of life on Pangaea, corridors that allowed animals and plants to move between different parts of the continent. Along these routes, species spread across the supercontinent, creating the widespread fossil patterns that scientists find today on continents now divided by oceans. Meanwhile, the coasts themselves were far from uniform. Some regions faced steady rainfall and supported dense swampy forests, while others lay in the rain shadows of massive mountain ranges, leaving them drier than their latitude might suggest. Monsoonal winds, driven by the immense size of Pangaea and the seasonal shift of the sun, brought alternating floods and droughts to certain coastal zones. The land was never static. Every year storms swept inland. Rivers swelled and then shrank, and forests adapted to cycles that repeated for millions of years. Adaptation and interconnection. The contrast between the coasts and the interior shaped more than just the landscape. It also influenced the behavior of the animals that lived there. Coastal regions were rich in food and supported a wider range of species. In the deserts, competition was fierce and life was specialized. Fossils show creatures in these arid zones with unique adaptations, from burrowing habits to specialized teeth designed to survive on tough dry.
vegetation. Life was not evenly
Distributed across Pangaea, but it was interconnected. The rivers flowing from the mountains to the coasts, the winds carrying dust from the deserts to the forests, and the migration paths of animals all tied these environments together. Even the air itself carried traces of this interconnectedness. Dust storms from the interior deserts likely traveled far, spreading minerals across Pangaea and even into the surrounding ocean. This constant movement of material linked the land and sea, feeding nutrient cycles that helped sustain ecosystems on both. To walk across Pangaea would have been to pass through these sharp contrasts, from the wet, teeming forests of the coasts to the empty, sun-baked expanses of the deserts, and finally back again as I neared
another distant sea. It was a single world.
But it contained within it climates and landscapes that today would be separated by oceans. This was the true scale of Pangaea, a land so vast that it carried its own extremes within it. And yet, despite these differences, this single supercontinent was not a static or finished creation. Its mountains still shifted. Its climate continued to evolve. Its deserts grew and shrank, while its coastal regions changed with the rise and fall of ancient seas. It was a world in motion, and that motion was far from over. The great interior, the deeper I moved into the heart of Pangaea, the farther I left the ocean's influence behind. Moisture from the coast did not reach this far. Winds lost their strength, and the air grew dry under an endless sky. This was the great interior, a land defined not by what it had, but by what it lacked. Here, rain was a rare visitor. Months could pass without a single storm, and when the clouds finally gathered, their showers would vanish almost as quickly as they arrived, swallowed by the thirsty ground. This interior was vast,
stretching for thousands of kilometers in every direction.
Modern deserts like the Sahara or the Gobi may seem enormous, but they are small compared to the dry expanses that dominated Pangaea's center. The ancient evidence geologists studying ancient rocks have uncovered layer after layer of red sandstone, iron-stained and baked in heat, proof of an arid world that endured for millions of years. These layers show a landscape sculpted by sun and wind, where rivers were few and lakes were temporary, vanishing when the short-lived rains faded again. The climate here was harsh and unrelenting.
During the day, the sun beat down without mercy.
Without clouds to soften its glare, the ground would have heated until the air shimmered with waves of rising heat. At night, the temperature dropped sharply. With no moisture to hold on to the warmth, the land cooled quickly, leaving the air cold and thin under a dome of stars. Life in this environment had to bend to its rules or vanish entirely. Hardy plants and survivors plants in this interior were sparse, but they were far from absent.
Low hardy vegetation clung to the soil.
Early conifers, seed ferns, and other drought-resistant species adapted to the constant struggle for water. Their roots reached deep, searching for moisture trapped far below the surface. The voice of the wind was a constant companion in the great interior. With no forest to hold it back, it swept across the open land, carrying dust from one horizon to the next. Over millions of years, this dust left its mark, settling in layers that still remain locked in the rock record. It would have been a world of muted colors, reds and browns baked by the sun, pale skies that shifted from dazzling blue to deep star-strewn black, and little else to break the monotony except the jagged outlines of distant mountains. Yet this harshness was not lifelessness.
Even in this dry core of Pangaea, ecosystems endured.
Small oases existed where underground springs surfaced. Seasonal floods from distant mountains carved temporary rivers through the parched land, drawing life from every direction. Fossils from these areas reveal sudden bursts of activity, evidence that for brief moments, these arid regions came alive when water returned, only to fall silent again when the heat reclaimed them. Isolation and adaptation. The size of this interior created another challenge: isolation for animals and plants that lived in the heart of Pangaea. The distances were staggering. Migration from one fertile region to another could take generations. Populations became specialized, shaped by the demands of the dry environment until they no longer resembled their relatives. From the coastal forests, this slow process of adaptation was one of the great engines of evolution in Pangaea's interior, producing species that could endure conditions few others could survive. The wind-driven climate also reshaped the land over time. Without heavy rainfall, erosion moved slowly. Rocky outcrops that formed during Pangaea's creation remained exposed for millions of years, their surfaces scoured but not erased. Sand carried by the constant gusts sculpted dunes and carved patterns into stone. These marks of ancient weather remain preserved in the rocks I study today, silent witnesses to a world where the desert seemed endless. Connection to the whole, despite its severity, the great interior was deeply connected to the rest of Pangaea. Dust from these dry lands drifted outward, carried by the wind into the wetter regions near the coasts, feeding distant forests with minerals. Seasonal storms, though rare, sometimes formed along the edges of the interior and swept outward, pushing dry air into greener lands and shifting weather patterns far beyond the desert's reach. In its own way, this empty expanse influenced the entire supercontinent, tying the fate of its interior to its coasts. To travel through the heart of Pangaea would have been to experience silence on a scale almost unknown today. No sound of waves, no dense canopy of leaves rustling in the wind. Only the sweep of air across stone and the occasional cry of an animal adapted to the emptiness. And yet this silence was not empty of meaning. It was here, in this great arid core, that life learned to endure its harshest tests, preparing for the challenges that lay ahead in the changing world to come. The surrounding ocean, while the heart of Pangaea was dominated by dry winds and empty horizons, its edges were shaped by an entirely different force, the surrounding ocean. Pangaea, the vast global sea that bordered the supercontinent, stretched outward in every direction, so immense that even from the coasts of Pangaea, it may have seemed endless. This single ocean was not merely a backdrop. It was one of the most powerful influences on the climate, ecosystems, and movement of life across the planet. Where land met sea, where the land met the sea, the world was transformed. Moisture carried inland by ocean winds fed the coastal regions, creating belts of life far greener than the barren interior. These areas were home to rivers swollen by seasonal rains, wetlands alive with primitive amphibians, and forests so dense that they formed nearly unbroken canopies in some regions. It was along these coasts that life thrived most abundantly, sustained by the constant interaction between land and water. The ocean itself was no less extraordinary. Pangaea covered nearly 3/4 of the planet, its deep currents circulating slowly but with immense reach. With only one massive continent to disrupt its flow, its waters moved around Pangaea in vast loops, distributing heat from the equator toward the poles. This steady movement helped regulate the climate of the coasts while leaving the interior lands to their extremes. The shallow seas, near the shorelines. However, Pangaea's influence was immediate and visible. Warm, shallow seas flooded low-lying regions along the continental margins. These shallow zones, sometimes stretching for hundreds of kilometers, were ideal for life. Ancient reefs built by early corals and sponges rose from the seabed. Schools of primitive fish swam through clear waters, while trilobite-like arthropods, though nearing the end of their reign, still clung to survival in isolated pockets. In these coastal waters, nutrient cycles connected the land to the sea. Rivers from the interior carried sediments rich with minerals, feeding the shallow marine ecosystems. These nutrients fueled blooms of plankton, which in turn supported a growing web of marine life. Fossils from these ancient seabeds tell me a story of abundance. Fishes of many forms, invertebrates with strange ornate shells, and predators that patrolled the waters long before the first dinosaurs walked on land. The moods of the sea, the coasts were also shaped by the ocean's moods. Seasonal monsoons, driven by the immense size of Pangaea, brought powerful storms to its edges. These rains replenished the rivers and wetlands, but they also brought flooding, reshaping the landscape year after year. In some regions, these storms may have carried salt-laden air inland, leaving behind crusted flats where water evaporated faster than it could collect. Each cycle carved another mark into the land, building a coastline that was in constant motion. Despite the challenges of its interior, Pangaea's coasts were places of connection. They linked the land to the ocean and acted as gateways for life between those two worlds. Amphibians ventured into the wetlands to lay their eggs, relying on the steady flow of fresh water. Reptiles followed, evolving traits that freed them from dependence on aquatic breeding, giving them the ability to move farther inland. Even the first primitive ancestors of mammals likely emerged near these coasts, their survival tied to the rich ecosystems that stretched between the sea and the land.
Life at the edge. The air along these edges would have been thick with life.
Insects buzzed through forests that bordered tidal flats. Early reptiles basked on sun-warmed rocks beside shallow lagoons. Primitive ferns and seed plants flourished in the humid climate, their roots gripping the nutrient-rich soil washed down from distant highlands. Every part of the coast was alive with movement, and every season brought new growth, new migrations, and new struggles for survival. But just as the ocean gave life, it also drew clear lines of contrast. While the coasts were lush and dynamic, a few hundred kilometers inland, the greenery would fade. Rainfall diminished and the air grew drier. The ocean's reach was powerful, but it was not limitless. The sharp gradient between fertile coastal zones and the arid interior was one of Pangaea's defining features, a reminder that even on a world of connected land, the edges and the center lived by very different rules. The dynamic coastline, the ocean itself, though seemingly constant, was far from still. Its tides and currents shaped erosion along Pangaea's coasts, cutting into cliffs and depositing sediments in new places. Some regions drowned under shallow seas for millions of years before the water retreated again. Others rose upward as the Earth's crust shifted, exposing once submerged seafloors to the air. This constant exchange between land and sea created a shifting map that forced life to adapt again and again, and Panthalassa was not alone. Along Pangaea's eastern edge lay the Paleo-Tethys Sea, a smaller but equally important body of water. It was here, in this relatively sheltered sea, that many early marine species found stable habitats. Shallow waters protected by long continental shelves became cradles of evolution, feeding a diversity of creatures that would later spread to the larger ocean. This sea was a counterpoint to Panthalassa's deep open expanse, offering quiet refuge while the rest of the planet's waters churned in their vast, uninterrupted gyres. Standing on Pangaea's coastline, I would have seen no distant islands, no neighboring continents rising from the waves, only the open ocean stretched to the horizon, an endless blue void that surrounded the one connected landmass on Earth, the sound of waves against the shore, the cry of primitive reptiles from the nearby forests, and the steady winds sweeping inland would have been a reminder that this world was vast, unbroken, and still in motion. The oceans at the edge of everything were not just boundaries. They were the living, breathing skin of the planet, binding water, air, and land into a single system that set the rhythm for life on Earth. And, from these coasts, the story of Pangaea would continue inward again, into the forests and plains that stretched between sea and desert, where the planet's strange and evolving life would take its next steps. The breath of Pangaea, the air of Pangaea, was not the same air I know today. It was thicker in some ages, thinner in others, and its very composition left its mark on the creatures and plants that filled the world. To step outside and breathe during this ancient time would have been to inhale an atmosphere, shaped by a planet in transition, one that carried both the weight of its geological past and the potential for everything that was still to come. Evidence locked in rock layers tells me that oxygen levels during parts of
Pangaea's existence were higher than what I breathe now.
In the late Carboniferous period, just before Pangaea reached its full form, oxygen may have made up as much as 30% of the atmosphere, compared to 21% today. The age of giants, that extra oxygen changed everything. It fueled the growth of enormous insects and arthropods, creatures that depended on simple diffusion to deliver oxygen through their bodies. Dragonflies with wingspans longer than a human arm soared over dense forests. Millipede-like invertebrates grew to lengths that would be startling in any modern landscape. The air, quite literally, allowed them to become giants. Yet the atmosphere did not remain constant. As Pangaea stabilized and entered the Permian period, oxygen levels began to decline. By the middle of that era, they may have dropped closer to 15%. Breathing in such conditions would have been challenging for modern humans, but the animals of that time were adapted to it. Their lungs and circulatory systems evolved to draw every bit of oxygen they needed from the thinning air. The shift reshaped ecosystems, favoring species that could endure lower oxygen and gradually pushing the oversized insects of earlier ages into decline. The role of carbon dioxide too played its part. Volcanic eruptions along Pangaea's fault lines released vast amounts of it into the atmosphere, warming the planet and fueling powerful weather systems. This greenhouse effect helped keep the coastal forests humid and lush, while in the great interior, the heat only deepened the aridity. The very chemistry of the air was tied to the geology of the supercontinent. Each eruption, each tectonic shift influencing life in ways that could be measured in the bones of the animals that survived. For plants, this atmosphere was both a challenge and an opportunity. High levels of carbon dioxide favored the growth of massive forests. Seed ferns, towering conifers, and other ancient plants thrived, their leaves pulling in the gas and releasing oxygen in return. These forests became vast oxygen factories, feeding the planet's atmosphere and anchoring the climate. When they spread along river valleys and coastal lands, they created pockets of breathable abundance in a world otherwise dominated by extremes. The circulation of air, but the connection between air and life ran deeper still. Atmospheric circulation, the movement of air around Pangaea, was unlike anything on Earth today. With nearly all the land gathered into one block, wind patterns became larger and simpler, moving unimpeded across thousands of kilometers. Warm air rose above the equator, driving powerful monsoons along the coasts, while cooler, dry air descended into the interior, feeding the deserts that sprawled across Pangaea's center. The atmosphere itself was an engine, and every living thing existed within its currents. Even the color of the sky may have been subtly different. Higher concentrations of volcanic aerosols during periods of intense eruptions would have filled the air with fine particles, scattering sunlight and tinting the horizon. Some sunsets might have burned a deep red, their glow carrying across the flat open lands of the interior. At other times, when the air cleared, the sky would have stretched in an unbroken blue arc, vast and sharp, with little moisture to soften it. Heat and adaptation. The breath of Pangaea also carried heat. Without the moderating influence of many smaller continents and oceans, the seasonal temperature swings were more intense. Summers in the interior baked under hot, dry air, while winters cooled sharply, the air turning thin and biting. The coastal regions were gentler, their air tempered by ocean breezes, but even there the rhythms of the supercontinent could be felt. When the monsoon season arrived, humid winds swept ashore, feeding the forests with warm, moisture-laden air. When those winds shifted away, dry air reclaimed the land, and, in this atmosphere, animals lived in lockstep with the air they breathed. Some evolved efficient lungs to pull oxygen from a thinning sky. Others became masters of stillness, conserving energy in heat and dryness. Plants adjusted their leaf structures, their pores opening and closing to preserve water, while still drawing in the gases they needed to grow. Every adaptation was a response to the air, and every change in the atmosphere rippled through the web of life. The common thread, but the most striking thing about Pangaea's air, was not just its chemistry, it was its reach. A single atmosphere wrapped every corner of the supercontinent. Winds that began in the deserts of the interior could sweep out to the coasts, carrying dust and minerals that would settle into distant soils. Moisture from the oceans could drift inland until it faded and fell. Air connected the deserts to the forests, the mountains to the plains, and every living thing to every other. To stand on Pangaea and breathe would have been to draw in that entire world at once. The dry heat of its interior, the salt-tinged winds from its coasts, the faint traces of volcanic gases carried from far-off eruptions. Every breath was a reminder that on this single continent, air was not divided or contained. It was the common thread that linked one end of the world to the other. And as the atmosphere shaped life, life in turn shaped the atmosphere, setting in motion a feedback loop that would define this era and prepare the planet for the changes to come. For in Pangaea's air, heavy with history and restless with motion, lay the seeds of everything that would follow. Life before the giants, the world of Pangaea was preparing for its next transformation. Its air, its deserts, its coasts, and its forests had already shaped the stage, and now life itself was beginning to respond. This was the age before the dinosaurs, an era in which the ancestors of future giants were taking their first steps. The Earth was not yet ruled by the towering creatures that would come later, but the foundations for their reign were being laid quietly, one adaptation at a time. During the late Carboniferous and into the Permian, life on land became more specialized. The forests near the coasts were dense, humid, and full of competition. Here, amphibians dominated the rivers and swamps, their lives tied closely to the water. But among them were new arrivals, reptiles, creatures that carried a revolutionary advantage: the amniotic egg. The revolutionary egg-like amphibians, reptiles no longer needed to return to water to reproduce. Their eggs, protected by shells and membranes, could survive on dry land. This single adaptation opened the door to the interior of Pangaea, to the deserts and dry plains that amphibians could not reach. These early reptiles were not yet the massive predators or towering herbivores of later ages. Many were small, quick, and low to the ground, feeding on insects and other small animals. But some began to grow larger. Among them were the synapsids, a group of creatures that would eventually give rise to mammals. In the Permian, however, they were the dominant land animals, and their forms were as strange as they were varied. The synapsids reigned some. Like Dimetrodon, carried enormous sails on their backs, perhaps for regulating temperature or for display. Others had powerful jaws and sturdy bodies built for endurance, roaming the drier lands of the supercontinent in search of prey. In the forests and along the riverbanks, herbivorous synapsids browsed on ferns and seed plants, their teeth adapted for grinding tough vegetation. They were stocky, slow-moving animals, but their size offered them protection. In this world of vast landscapes and harsh climates, being large was an advantage. It allowed them to travel farther in search of food, endure longer without water, and survive the swings of Pangaea's seasons. The age of giant insects. The insects of this age were still remarkable in their own right. With oxygen levels higher in the earlier periods of Pangaea's history, some had reached sizes that would seem impossible now. Dragonflies with wings nearly a meter across glided over rivers. Millipede-like arthropods stretched several feet in length, crawling across the forest floor. Although their dominance was beginning to wane as oxygen levels declined, they remained a defining feature of the landscape, reminders of a time when the air itself had allowed life to grow to astonishing proportions. The oceans, team in the ocean surrounding Pangaea, life was equally dynamic. Large predatory fish, armored with thick scales, hunted in the open waters. In the shallows, early sharks prowled, sleek and efficient, their lineage already well established. Along the coasts and in the smaller inland seas, invertebrates like brachiopods, ammonites, and crinoids populated the seafloor, filtering nutrients carried by the currents of Panthalassa. The oceans were vast and deep, but they were connected to the rhythms of the land. Dust from the deserts of Pangaea carried nutrients into the sea, and floods from the coastal rivers replenished the coastal shelves with minerals that sustained marine ecosystems. The first giants back on land. The first great experiments in size were beginning to appear. Among the synapsids and reptiles were forms that hinted at what was coming. Some grew heavier and more imposing, testing the limits of what the land could support. Their skeletons, preserved in stone, show sturdy limbs built to carry bulk and teeth designed for a range of diets. These were not yet the giants of the later Triassic and Jurassic, but they were their precursors. Evolution's first attempts at filling the enormous spaces of Pangaea with equally enormous creatures. The climate of the supercontinent drove this process forward. In the lush coastal regions, food was abundant. Forests produced layer upon layer of vegetation, and herbivores could feed almost without pause. In the arid interior, by contrast, survival favored endurance and size. Larger animals could travel farther for water and store energy. Over millions of years, these pressures shaped the bodies of the creatures that lived there, setting the stage for the rise of the great lineages to come. Predators and prey. Predators followed. As herbivores grew larger, so too did the hunters that preyed on them. Early reptilian predators with long jaws and sharp teeth evolved to match their quarry in strength and speed. These arms races of size and power would continue into the Triassic, where they would give birth to the first true giants of the Mesozoic, the age of the dinosaurs. But even now, in this earlier time, the pattern was clear. Pangaea was a world that rewarded adaptation on a grand scale. The power of connection, the interconnectedness of the supercontinent helped as well. With no oceans to block their path, species could spread across vast distances, carrying new traits from one region to another. A predator that evolved in one corner of Pangaea could, over time, follow its prey into entirely different climates. Herbivores could migrate from the wetter coasts to the drier interior, their populations branching and adapting to the unique conditions of each new region. Evolution did not happen in isolation here. It unfolded on a continental stage, and every movement of wind, every shift of the seasons, and every geological change rippled through that immense connected system. And while the giants of the future had not yet arrived, the groundwork was set. The forests were spreading. The deserts were waiting. The atmosphere was changing. And in the quiet spaces between survival and adaptation, life was preparing to grow larger, stronger, and stranger than ever before. The ancient forests across the vast stretches of Pangaea, the forests were unlike anything I know today. They were older, stranger, and built from forms of life that had long since vanished from the earth. These ancient woodlands were the lungs of the supercontinent, shaping the atmosphere, anchoring the soil, and providing shelter for the growing diversity of animals that roamed the land. To walk beneath their canopy would have been to step into a world both alien and familiar, a place where evolution was still experimenting with the building blocks of future ecosystems. The coastal forests in the humid belts near the coasts, the forests were dense and towering. Great seed ferns with fronds as broad as the span of human arms formed thickets so thick that little sunlight reached the ground. These plants, neither true ferns nor flowering trees, dominated vast areas of Pangaea's lands. Their stems and leaves built sprawling networks of shade under which smaller plants competed for every sliver of light. In this dim green world, the air was heavy with moisture, and the ground was layered with thick mats of decaying vegetation that would one day become the coal seams buried deep beneath modern continents, the towering conifers towering. Above the seed, ferns were the early conifers. These were the ancestors of the pines, firs and spruces of today, but in the Permian and Triassic, they were pioneering giants. Their needle-like leaves allowed them to survive in a wider range of climates, from the wetlands to the drier uplands that bordered the interior of Pangaea. Their wood, strong and resinous, supported trunks that reached skyward, creating vertical layers within the forest. Among these branches, small reptiles and early insects found refuge, their movements hidden beneath the evergreen canopy. The drier lands closer to the interior, where the climate grew harsher and rainfall scarce, the forests thinned. Here, drought-tolerant plants dominated, hardy conifers, low-growing shrubs and cycads with stiff, leathery leaves. These cycads, with their strange, crown-like tops of fronds, seemed like relics from an older time. They thrived in places where few other plants could take root, anchoring the soil and feeding the herbivores that ventured into the dry lands between the forests and the great deserts of Pangaea's core. In some regions, especially near the coasts and river valleys, forests merged with vast wetlands. These swampy ecosystems were dominated by ancient horsetails and club mosses, plants that once reached heights far greater than their modern descendants. Their hollow, jointed stems formed dense stands along the water's edge, their roots binding the soil against the shifting currents. These wetlands were nurseries of life, sheltering amphibians that needed water to breed, while early reptiles patrolled the edges in search of prey. The living canopy, the forests of Pangaea, were not silent. Insects filled the air with a constant hum, their wings flashing in the dappled light. Giant dragonflies, their wings beating slowly, skimmed above clearings and riverbanks. On the ground, millipede-like arthropods crept through the thick leaf litter, while beetles and early ants began their quiet work of breaking down decaying plant matter. Every sound and movement in these forests was part of an intricate web that tied the entire ecosystem together. And where there was plant life in abundance, herbivores followed. Early synapsids and reptiles browsed among the ferns and cycads, their jaws adapted to grind through fibrous vegetation. Some carried squat, barrel-shaped bodies to house powerful digestive systems capable of extracting every bit of energy from the tough plants of Pangaea's forests. Their tracks, preserved in stone, crisscross ancient floodplains that were once shaded by trees now long gone. Predators in the shadows. Even predators depended on these forests, though not for food directly. The dense vegetation provided cover for ambush hunters. Smaller reptiles and early carnivorous synapsids stalked the shadows, their movements hidden by the layers of plants. The forests were both sanctuary and hunting ground, a place where every leaf and branch played a role in survival. The air in these forests would have felt different from the dry winds of the interior. Humid and heavy, it carried the scent of resin, wet soil, and decaying plant matter. Sunlight broke through in narrow shafts, striking the forest floor in fleeting patches. In the coastal lowlands, fog sometimes rolled in from the ocean, wrapping the trees in a pale mist that lingered until the heat of the day burned it away. The northern and southern reaches, farther north and south, where the climate cooled, the forests changed again. Conifers became more dominant, their evergreen needles adapted to survive in regions where winters could bring frost. These forests were sparser than their equatorial counterparts, but they were resilient, holding their ground even as the seasons turned. All across Pangaea, The forests connected the land. They followed the rivers deep into the interior, stretched across the coasts, and climbed the foothills of mountain ranges born from the continent's great collisions. They were not a single, unbroken expanse, but a network of green that bound the supercontinent together, feeding its air with oxygen and shaping the evolution of its creatures. The stage for transformation, in time, these forests would also become the stage for transformation. As climate shifted and the Earth's atmosphere changed, the plants that had ruled Pangaea for millions of years would face new competition. But in this moment, during the height of the supercontinent's age, the forests stood at their peak, vast, untamed, and home to the first true foundations of the world that was still to come.